Many of us like to think that we are in control of our financial lives, but the reality is that many of those financial decisions were already made for us. If you think about the rate of your mortgage, the prices at your grocery store, and the stability of your employment, what do these three have in common? The Fed, the US Federal Reserve, is one of the most powerful central banks in the whole world. But how can it have so much global influence? And why are there so many conspiracy theories about it? In this episode, we'll learn about the Fed's evolution of power, its structure, which is unlike any other central bank, and the reason why the Fed influences our lives and the world's economy. The Federal Reserve's responsibilities are confusing for an average American, even though we constantly hear about the Fed in the news. That's why several conspiracy theories appear over the years. Some believe that a secret group of bankers control the Fed to manipulate the global economy. Others say that the Fed deliberately causes economic recession to benefit the wealthy or adjust interest rates to suppress economic growth and benefit the government. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments. In the meantime, let's check the Fed's structure and primary goals to better understand what they do.
We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals.
Exactly. In short, the Fed focuses on two crucial economic metrics: unemployment and inflation. Stabilizing prices and achieving sustainable employment sounds pretty clear, but it is easier said than done. What tools does the Fed have to reach its goal? Well, first of all, conducting monetary policy. This means the Fed determines how much money is floating in the US economy to be spent on goods or services. By controlling the money supply, the Federal Reserve can influence both interest rates and the overall economy's health. The next task is supervising banks. The Fed regulates financial institutions to ensure they operate safely. The examination process typically includes reviewing the bank's financial statements, risk management policies, asset qualities, earnings, liquidity, and capital adequacy. Another Fed's responsibility is maintaining financial stability. This means monitoring and assessing the system's risk and taking action to address any threats. And the last task the Fed is responsible for is providing financial services. The Federal Reserve delivers financial assistance to the US government, including processing payments, selling government securities, and maintaining accounts. It also offers financial services to banks, such as lending money through the discount window. The Fed's responsibilities are the typical ones for any central bank in the world. However, what's far from ordinary is its structure. The Federal Reserve System consists of three entities: the Board of Governors, the Federal Open Market Committee, known as the FOMC, and the 12 Federal Reserve banks. Basically, the Fed doesn't act as a single central bank like in most countries. Instead, there is a decentralized system with 12 banks. When establishing the Federal Reserve System, the US was divided geographically into 12 districts, each forming a reserve bank. District boundaries corresponded to the trade regions that existed at the beginning of the 20th century, so they don't necessarily coincide with state lines. Missouri, for example, has 2 Federal Reserve banks within its borders. The 12 Federal Reserve districts operate independently, but with the supervision of the Board of Governors. The Board of Governors is the main policy-making body of the Federal Reserve System. It consists of 7 members appointed by the US President and confirmed by the Senate. The Board of Governors is responsible for setting monetary policy, supervising and regulating banks, and ensuring the financial system stability. The third primary entity of the Fed is the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, which consists of 12 members. 7 of them are members of the Board of Governors, the President of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and the remaining 4 are the presidents of the remaining 11 Federal Reserve banks. The FOMC is responsible for open market operations, the Fed's key tool in implementing monetary policy. As you can see, the Board of Governors is an independent federal government agency. 12 reserve banks are the operating hands of the Fed, and the Federal Open Market Committee ensures coordination between the reserve banks. The Fed and all its entities are directly accountable to Congress. This structure was reworked and improved since the central bank's creation in 1913. The Fed appeared in response to numerous financial panics and crises that the US faced during the late 19th and 20th centuries. There were hot debates on the idea of the US central bank for many years, but the panic of 1907 aligned public and political opinions to establish a central banking system. Senator Nelson Aldrich was one of the key figures in the creation of the Federal Reserve. In 1908, he gathered a group of bankers and economists at a secret meeting on Jekyll Island in Georgia to discuss proposals for a central banking system. There were representatives from the country's largest banks, including JP Morgan, as well as economies and lawyers. That meeting formed the basis for the Federal Reserve Act, introduced in Congress in 1913. It generated debates that lasted several months. The final version of the act established a system of 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, each with its own board of directors, as well as a Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C. President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law on December 23, 1913. And the first Federal Reserve banks opened for business the following year. The early years of the Federal Reserve were controversial. Some critics argue that the Fed was too powerful and threatened the banking system's independence. Others criticized the Federal Reserve tactics, including its monetary policy used to combat inflation and promote economic growth. Despite these criticisms, the Federal Reserve continued to play a critical role in the U.S. financial system. Over the years, adapted to changing conditions, becoming a key institution in the global economy. But how can a national central bank have international influence? And how does the Fed really control the world? Well, the Federal Reserve primarily focuses on managing the American economy and financial system, and its influence is limited outside of the US. However, the US is the world's largest economy, and changes in its monetary policy affect many countries. The dollar is the main reserve currency globally, so even nationwide events in the US have consequences worldwide. One way the Federal Reserve can indirectly influence other countries is through its monetary policy decisions, such as changes to interest rates, which can affect capital flow to other countries. For example, let's suppose US interest rates dropped compared to rates in other countries. When that happens, investors are more likely to finance American assets, strengthening the US dollar and weakening other currencies. In addition, the Federal Reserve has relationships with other central banks worldwide. Together, they address global economic challenges or coordinate responses to financial crises. The Federal Reserve also participates in the Bank for International Settlements. This organization gives even more opportunities to alter the world's financial system. Overall, the Federal Reserve has no official power or tools to influence any other country outside the US. Still, its actions continue to affect the global economy. That's the reason why some say the Federal Reserve controls the world. While many perceive it as a conspiracy theory, it is partially truth. Many also believe that taxpayers finance the Fed, but it doesn't receive funding through the congressional budget. So how does it generate income then? Well, the Federal Reserve System makes money primarily through the interest earned on its holding of US government securities and other investments. When the Fed buys government securities, it creates new money to pay for them, which increases the monetary supply. When it sells those securities, it destroys the money it receives in return, which reduces the money supply. The difference between the interest earned on its asset and the interest paid on its liability is the Fed's net income. However, the Federal Reserve doesn't keep it. The income goes straight to the US Treasury. The amount of money the Federal Reserve earns varies from year to year, based on changes in interest rates and the composition of its asset portfolio. In 2022, the assets Fed net income was over $58 billion, and in 2022, it reached $109 billion. Additionally, banks pay fees to the Federal Reserve System for various services. These fees help cover the Fed's operational costs. Banks are required to hold 6% of their money at the Federal Reserve to ensure they have enough funds to meet their obligations to depositors and creditors. The Fed pays interest on these reserve balances, which is currently 0.15% per year, and deducts a small fee from the interest earned to cover the cost of its operations. Banks also pay fees for various services provided by the Federal Reserve banks, such as check clearing, wire transfers, and currency processing. The fees charged for these services vary based on their type and volume. The amount banks pay to the Fed depends on the size and complexity of the bank's operation. For example, in 2020, JP Morgan Chase paid $1.7 billion to the Federal Reserve System, while smaller banks may pay a few $1,000s yearly. Despite these earnings, the Federal Reserve System is a non-profit entity, and all its profits go to the U.S. Treasury. There are several other reasons why the Fed is criticized, such as lack of accountability, excessive quantitative easing, policies that can form asset bubbles, and bank bailout at the taxpayer's expense. The Fed's opposition even claims that the best scenario will be to end the Federal Reserve altogether.
And yes, we should get rid of the Federal Reserve.
But what could happen if there was no Federal Reserve at all? Let's imagine that just for a second. If the Fed didn't exist, the US financial system will be very different. Of course, it is hard to say for sure, but some potential consequences could be the lack of financial stability. One of the Fed's key functions is to act as a lender of last resort to banks during times of crisis. That's why the Federal Reserve appeared on the first place. Otherwise, in times of instability, people will simply panic and withdraw all their money from the banks. This is something that can still happen today. A clear example was what happened recently with Silicon Valley Bank. Without the Fed, there will be no coordination for monetary policy. The Federal Reserve plays a critical role in setting interest rates and managing the money supply, meaning the volume of money in the financial system. Not having this regulator could lead to greater volatility in interest rates and uncontrolled inflation. No Fed means no consumer protection. In case of fraud, the Federal Reserve can secure every citizen, but who will guarantee safe banking for consumers if the Fed wasn't here? Another consequence is the lack of control over the payment system. Without the Fed, there will be no entity to ensure the safety and efficiency of those financial procedures. Now, the Federal Reserve oversees the payment system, including check processing, electronic payment, and wire transfers. Overall, the absence of the Fed could lead to a less stable and more volatile financial system, and another institution will still have to cover its responsibility. That's why there are very few countries without central banks. Most of those locations are microstates or island countries that use currencies and regulations of other states. So the Fed's absence might simply lead to chaos in the financial system. Despite all the criticism, if we look at the unemployment rate in G20 countries, the US scores 3.6%, which is one of the lowest rates. Singapore takes the leading position with 2% employment, while South Africa has the highest result, over 32%. It's also worth mentioning that American wages on average, are 25% higher than in most developed countries. The second essential parameter under the Fed's responsibility is inflation. If we look at the data, even though the US inflation rate now is at an all-time high since 1983, it is still lower than in most countries. Still, the topic of the Fed generates polarized opinions. Some even believe that it's holding back and being passive.
We have a Fed that is not exactly proactive.
Others assure that the Federal Reserve already has too much influence.
I think they have too much power ever since 1913.
Countless articles are trying to determine whether the Fed is too powerful. But how did it even come to this point? Why don't most countries think of the central banks this way? To answer this question, let's see how the Federal Reserve responsibilities change over time. As the US economy and financial system evolved, the Fed also adjusted and changed its responsibilities. Let's look at several key phases of the Federal Reserve's evolution. After its creation in 1913, the Fed had a primary goal of promoting financial stability and being a lender of last resort for banks during times of crisis. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, the Fed's role expanded with new powers to regulate and supervise the banking system and promote economic growth and full employment. In the post-World War II era, the Fed focused on maintaining price stability. The Federal Reserve received more independence from political influence, and it began to use monetary policy tools such as the open market operations to influence interest rates and the money supply. During the 1970s and 1980s, the Fed focus shifted again to controlling inflation. The central bank implemented new tools such as the federal funds rate and targeted inflation levels to achieve its price stability goals. During the 2008 financial crisis and Great Recessions, the Fed's role expanded once again. It implemented unconventional policy tools such as quantitative easing (QE) and new regulations to strengthen the banking system to prevent future financial crises. So basically, the Fed gained its power by responding to the crisis and bringing the US economy back on track, which doesn't sound too bad. The topic of the Fed will always be one for debate. You might agree with their policies or be completely opposed to them, but there is no doubt that the Federal Reserve's action influenced the global economy more than we thought. And that's it for today. See you in the next video. Bye-bye.